I wasn't looking for the end of a civilization when I started this investigation. I was researching climate anomalies in the early 19th century, sudden temperature drops, freak snowstorms in summer, crop failures across multiple continents, the kind of thing you attribute to volcanic eruptions or solar cycles and move on. But then I found the diaries. Not legends, not myths passed down through generations of embellishment, actual handwritten testimonies from May 19, 1816. Hundreds of them, from different countries, different languages, different social classes, all describing the same event with disturbing precision. A day when the sun didn't rise. Not figuratively, literally. A day that vanished from official history, dismissed as part of the year without a summer, and blamed entirely on Mount Tambora's eruption. Except Tambora erupted in April 1815, a full 13 months earlier. And that's when the official explanation began to collapse. The deeper I went, the more accounts I uncovered. Personal journals from Germany describing Der dunkle Tag, the dark day. French newspapers reporting l'obscurité totale, total darkness at noon. Russian imperial records mentioning Chorny Deng, black day, with temperature drops so severe that livestock froze in their barns. British correspondents from India describing 3 days of unnatural twilight. American farmers' almanacs noting the sun appeared green before it disappeared entirely. These weren't isolated incidents. These were coordinated observations from people who had no way to communicate with each other, separated by thousands of miles, all witnessing the same impossible event. May 19, 1816, the day the sky went dark. Not gradually, like a storm rolling in, instantaneously. Witnesses describe it happening between one breath and the next. Noon became midnight in seconds. The temperature plummeted. Snow fell in Rome. Ice formed on lakes in Switzerland in the middle of spring. And here's what disturbs me most. This wasn't just recorded in personal diaries. Major newspapers covered it. The Times of London published multiple articles. German scientific journals documented the phenomenon. French meteorological stations recorded the data. Then something changed. After 1820, the references stop. Not gradually, abruptly. The event that dominated headlines for months simply disappeared from historical discourse. Later editions of encyclopedias that mentioned it in earlier printings suddenly omitted all references. Scientific papers that analyzed the darkness were withdrawn from circulation. Archives that should contain meteorological records from May 1816 are mysteriously incomplete, and every history book now attributes the entire year's climate disruption to Tambora alone, despite the timeline not matching, despite the eyewitness accounts describing something far more sudden and catastrophic than volcanic ash distribution. Why would you erase an event witnessed by millions? Why would you systematically remove references to the darkest day in recorded modern history? Unless that day marked something more significant than a climate anomaly. Unless it marked the end of something that wasn't supposed to be remembered. That's where Tartaria becomes impossible to ignore. If you examine maps from 1815, Tartaria appears as a vast empire spanning northern and central Asia. Not a small territory, not a tribal region, an actual empire labeled with the same cartographic certainty as France, Spain, or the Ottoman Empire. Then you look at maps from 1820. Tartaria is gone. Not conquered and renamed, not absorbed into another empire with documentation, simply erased. The territory is either left blank, labeled as unknown, or suddenly divided among empires that supposedly controlled it all along, despite no historical records of conquest, no treaties of annexation, no military campaigns that would explain such a massive territorial acquisition. The timeline is too precise to be coincidence. May 19, 1816, the dark day occurs.
Within 4 years, Tartaria disappears from every map. Within 10 years, encyclopedias stop mentioning it entirely. Within 20 years, it's as if it never existed. But the architecture remains. Massive structures across Central Asia, Russia, Siberia, buildings of impossible scale and precision, doorways 15 feet high, halls that echo with vastness, staircases requiring strides too long for normal human proportions, all supposedly built by various empires or local populations with no documentation, no verified construction records, no explanation for how they achieved such engineering feats with 18th century technology. And many of these buildings show signs of catastrophic damage from a single event. Not gradual deterioration, not damage from multiple conflicts over centuries, concentrated destruction from one specific period. Scorch marks that don't match fire damage, stone surfaces that show evidence of extreme heat exposure but no surrounding burn patterns, structural failures that suggest sudden, massive force rather than siege or earthquake. Metallurgical analysis of metal fixtures in these buildings shows exposure to temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Celsius, temperatures that shouldn't be possible from conventional fires or any known 19th century warfare. What if the Dark Day wasn't just an atmospheric phenomenon? What if it marked the moment Tartaria fell? What if whatever caused the sky to go black, temperatures to plummet, snow in May and darkness at noon, was the same force that destroyed an empire so completely that it had to be erased from history? The eyewitness accounts support this. In the diaries, people don't just describe darkness, they describe light before the darkness, unusual light. Multiple sources from different countries mention the sky turning red, then orange, then an unnatural green in the hours before the darkness fell. They describe electrical phenomena, aurora-like displays at latitudes where auroras don't occur. They describe a sound, a low-frequency hum that lasted for hours before the event. And they describe the aftermath, the strange ash that fell for days, ash that didn't match volcanic composition, the way compasses stopped working correctly for weeks, the mass die-offs of birds found dead by the thousands with no visible injuries, the reports of structures collapsing in regions far from any volcanic or seismic activity. This wasn't Tambora. Tambora's effects were gradual, spreading over months as ash circulated through the atmosphere. This was instantaneous. This was localized to specific regions. This was targeted. I know how that sounds, but when you place all the evidence side by side, the accounts of the Dark Day, the disappearance of Tartaria, the damaged architecture, the systematic erasure from historical records, the pattern becomes too consistent to dismiss. Something happened in May 1816 that wasn't supposed to be remembered. Something that required rewriting maps, suppressing eyewitness testimony, and creating an alternative explanation that people would accept without question. And it worked. For 2 centuries, we've accepted the year without a summer as nothing more than a volcanic winter. We've ignored the testimonies of millions who witnessed something far stranger. We've forgotten that an empire vanished in the same moment the sky went dark.
Surviving copies in a private collection sold at auction to a buyer who had no idea what they were purchasing. The astronomer's name appears nowhere else in historical records after this date. No further publications, no record of his death. He simply vanishes from documentation as completely as Tartaria itself. This pattern repeats across multiple countries. Experts who questioned the official narrative disappeared from public discourse. Research that suggested alternative explanations was withdrawn. Data that contradicted the volcanic theory went missing. And slowly, methodically, a single acceptable explanation was constructed and reinforced until it became unquestionable fact. But the physical evidence tells a different story. In museums across Russia and Central Asia, there are artifacts from the early 19th century that don't fit the accepted timeline. I'm talking about metallurgical samples,
tools, structural components from buildings supposedly constructed in the 1700s, all showing evidence of exposure to extreme energetic events in a narrow time frame around 1816. The metal shows a specific type of crystalline structure that only forms under rapid, intense heating, followed by equally rapid cooling. Not the gradual temperature changes of a fire, not the sustained heat of a forge, instantaneous exposure to temperatures exceeding anything achievable with 19th century technology. Geologists have documented similar anomalies. Rock samples from quarries in Siberia, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia show fusion patterns dated to the early 19th century. Fusion, stone melted and re-solidified. The temperatures required would be thousands of degrees, sustained long enough to penetrate inches into solid rock. No conventional explanation accounts for this. No volcanic eruption produces such localized, intense heat. No known natural phenomenon creates these patterns. Yet the samples exist in multiple locations across the former territories of Tartaria, all dated to the same approximate period, all dismissed as anomalies or measurement errors without further investigation. Then there are the trees. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, provides an unbiased climate record. Trees across the northern hemisphere show the expected markers of cold temperatures in 1816, the narrow rings indicating poor growing conditions that align with the year without a summer. But there's something else in those rings, a layer of scar tissue in trees across a specific geographic band running through Central Asia, corresponding exactly to 1816. Not cold damage, not frost rings, traumatic growth disruption, the kind of cellular damage that occurs when living tissue is exposed to radiation or extreme electromagnetic fields. I consulted with 3 separate dendrochronologists. All confirmed the anomaly. None could explain it. The damage pattern is too uniform across too vast an area to be natural. It suggests simultaneous exposure to something that affected every tree in the region at the same moment. And the region? It corresponds precisely to the mapped territory of Tartaria. You can trace the boundaries of the empire by following the tree damage. Outside those boundaries, normal growth rings. Inside, traumatic disruption in the 1816 layer. It's like an outline drawn in living wood, marking the exact moment something catastrophic swept across that specific territory and nowhere else. This is why the Dark Day matters. It wasn't a global event, it was targeted. The darkness witnesses described in Europe was the secondary effect, the atmospheric disruption from something that happened elsewhere. The primary event occurred in Central Asia. That's where the real damage is concentrated. That's where the evidence of extreme temperatures, fusion, and electromagnetic disruption clusters. That's where Tartaria was, and that's where Tartaria ended. I started finding survivor accounts, not from Tartaria itself, those are conspicuously absent, but from the periphery. Travelers who were in the region in early 1816 and left before May. Merchants, diplomats, explorers who documented what they saw. One account from a British trade envoy describes visiting a city in what he calls Tartary in March 1816. He describes it as prosperous, technologically advanced beyond what he expected, with infrastructure that impressed him despite his British imperial prejudices. He planned to return in June to finalize trade agreements. He never made it back. When he attempted to return in July, he found the routes blocked by Russian military forces. The official explanation was political instability, but his journal entry from August describes meeting refugees, people fleeing westward with stories of complete destruction. He writes about cities reduced to ruins overnight, about populations vanished, about a light in the sky so bright it burned the eyes of those who looked directly at it.
His journal was never published. It remained in his family's private papers until it was donated to an archive in 1923. By then, no one knew what Tartary was. The account was filed as the delusional writings of a man who suffered from tropical fever. But the details are too specific, the dates too precise, the descriptions too consistent with other fragmentary accounts I found scattered across archives, each dismissed individually as unreliable, but collectively forming a coherent narrative of catastrophic destruction in a specific place at a specific time. Whatever happened in May 1816 didn't just kill people, it erased infrastructure, destroyed cities, and left physical scars in the geological record that persist to this day. And then it was systematically covered up, replaced with a simpler explanation that asked fewer uncomfortable questions. Because if you admit that the dark day was real, if you acknowledge that something caused instantaneous darkness across multiple continents, extreme temperatures capable of melting stone, and electromagnetic disruption that traumatized every tree in a territory the size of Europe, then you have to ask what could do that, and you have to admit that whatever did it happened to the exact place and at the exact moment when Tartaria disappeared from history. The official silence is what convinces me most. When you find something this significant, something supported by physical evidence, eyewitness testimony, and documentary records, the natural academic response should be investigation. Instead, there's systematic dismissal. I've contacted 17 universities with archaeology and historical departments. I've presented the evidence, the newspaper archives, the metallurgical analysis, the dendrochronology data, the architectural surveys. The response is always the same: interesting but not significant, as if patterns don't matter, as if coordinated evidence from multiple independent sources means nothing, as if asking why is somehow inappropriate. 3 researchers initially expressed interest. One was a geologist specializing in impact events. She examined the fusion patterns in the rock samples and confirmed they matched no known volcanic signature. She agreed to co-author a paper. 2 weeks later, she withdrew, citing detrimental pressure. Her university had received a communication, she wouldn't say from whom, suggesting that pursuing this research would be detrimental to future funding applications. The second was a historian focusing on Central Asian empires. He had independently noticed the cartographic discontinuity, Tartaria's sudden disappearance from maps. He was compiling evidence of trade routes and diplomatic correspondence that proved Tartaria existed as a functioning state well into the early 1800s. His research was denied publication. The journal's review committee called it revisionist speculation, despite the primary sources he provided. He was advised to focus on more established historical narratives. The third was a climatologist studying the 1816 climate anomalies. She found the same inconsistencies I did: the timeline problems with the Tambora explanation, the localized nature of the most severe effects, and the evidence of something beyond volcanic activity. She submitted her findings to 3 different scientific journals, all rejected without peer review. One editor told her off the record that certain topics were considered too controversial for publication, regardless of the evidence. This is not how science works. This is not how historical inquiry works. This is suppression. When evidence threatens an established narrative, when questions lead to uncomfortable implications, the academic system doesn't engage, it shuts down. And it's been shutting down inquiry into 1816 and Tartaria for 200 years. But the evidence keeps emerging. In 2019, construction crews in Kazakhstan uncovered a mass burial site during excavation for a new building. Preliminary analysis suggested early 19th century based on artifacts and clothing remnants. The bodies showed no signs of disease, no evidence of violence, no indication of how they died, just hundreds of people buried hastily in a mass grave around 1816. The site was documented, then quietly closed. The remains were removed to a government facility. No further analysis was published, no archaeological report was released. The construction project
cellular damage consistent with radiation exposure, though she stressed that 19th century radiation sources didn't exist in that region as far as conventional history knows. She was ordered not to pursue the investigation further. Similar discoveries keep happening. A foundation excavation in Siberia in 2021 revealed structural remains of a city that doesn't appear in any historical records. The architecture matched the oversized proportions I'd documented elsewhere. The metallurgy was advanced beyond what should have existed in that region at that time. Dating placed it in active use until approximately 1816, then sudden abandonment. Geological analysis of the site showed evidence of a massive thermal event. The excavation was halted, the site was sealed, and the land was declared protected for environmental reasons, permanently closed to further study. Every time physical evidence emerges that could prove what happened, it disappears into classified archives or is destroyed under official pretexts. Every researcher who gets close to the truth faces career consequences. Every publication that attempts to present the evidence is rejected or retracted. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidence. Someone doesn't want this investigated. Someone with enough influence to suppress research across multiple countries, multiple academic disciplines, multiple generations of scholars. But they can't suppress everything. The tree rings still show the damage. The newspapers still exist in private collections. The rock samples are still anomalous. The buildings still stand with their inexplicable scorch marks and impossible proportions. The maps still show the before and after, Tartaria present, then absent. And the diaries still describe the dark day with disturbing clarity. I keep returning to one account in particular, a journal from a German merchant who was in Moscow in May 1816. He describes the morning of the 19th as clear and warm. By noon, he writes, the sky began to change colors, cycling through red, orange, green, and violet in rapid succession. Then darkness fell like a curtain dropping, total darkness. He lit candles in his room and waited. The darkness lasted, according to his timepiece, for 7 hours and 43 minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it fell, light returned. But the light was wrong, he writes. The sun looked smaller, dimmer, greenish, and it stayed that way for 3 days before gradually returning to normal. During those 3 days, he attempted to travel east toward his planned trade route through Central Asia. He made it 50 miles before encountering Russian military checkpoints that hadn't existed a week earlier. The roads were closed, no explanation given. He was turned back. When he asked about the cities he had planned to visit, cities he had traded with for years, the soldiers claimed not to know what he was talking about. Those cities, they said, didn't exist. He returned to Moscow confused and disturbed. Over the following weeks, he attempted to contact his trade partners in the East. No letters reached them. Inquiries about the trade routes were met with blank stares or outright denial that such routes had ever existed. Within 6 months, all his documentation of previous trades, contracts, shipping manifests, everything that proved he had conducted business in Tartarian territories was confiscated by Russian authorities under vague legal pretexts. He writes in his final journal entry dated December 1816 that he feels as if he dreamed an entire empire, as if the places he visited, the people he knew, the cities he traded with for a decade never existed. But he knows they did. He has scars from a knife fight in a Tartarian market. He has a ring given to him by a Tartarian merchant as a gift. He has memories too specific to be imagination, yet the world now insists these places never were. His journal ends with a question. If they can erase an empire, if they can make millions of people and thousands of miles of territory simply vanish from accepted reality, what else have they erased? What else are we forbidden to remember? I don't have definitive answers. I have evidence, patterns, questions that accumulate, that build upon each other, that create a weight the official narrative cannot support.
I have physical proof of catastrophic destruction in 1816. I have eyewitness accounts of the dark day from hundreds of independent sources. I have documentation of Tartaria's existence, followed by its systematic removal from cartographic and historical records. I have the suppression of research, the destruction of evidence, the silencing of inquiry. And I have the simple, undeniable fact that something happened in May 1816 that the established historical narrative cannot explain. The sky went dark, an empire vanished, the records were erased, and for 2 centuries we've accepted the lie that it was just a volcano, just bad weather, just an unfortunate year. But the truth persists in the tree rings, in the fusion patterns, in the mass graves, in the buildings that shouldn't exist, in the newspapers that were never supposed to survive. The last hours of Tartaria were real. The dark day happened, and whatever force destroyed an entire civilization in a matter of hours, whatever technology or weapon or phenomenon could cause instantaneous darkness across continents and temperatures hot enough to melt stone, it existed in 1816, which means it might exist now. Which means the people who erased Tartaria from history, who suppressed the evidence, who silenced the researchers, who maintain the official lie, they're still here, still watching, still ensuring that certain questions are never asked, still making sure that the dark day remains forgotten. But I remember, the evidence remembers, and now you know. The giants weren't the only thing they erased from history. They erased an entire empire, an entire catastrophe, an entire day when the world nearly ended. And they'll keep erasing it, keep denying it, keep suppressing it, as long as we let them. So I'm asking you, what else don't we know? What else vanished in the darkness? And what happens when the sky goes dark again?